The script for this video was originally much shorter and served as a presentation for a conference put on by an organization that I'm no longer associated with. Given the hard work that I put into it and the fact that the topic was what I view as an essential message, I decided to revisit it and expand it to cover the breadth of it more thoroughly than I could in a presentation meant to only be 10 minutes or less. This is going to be a bit longer than my usual content, as what I found when I dug into the history of the term expanded the conversation for me as an author in a way I didn't expect. I plan on putting timestamp dividers in the description so you all can watch it in segments if it's a bit longer than you're used to. It ultimately serves as a thesis statement for my ongoing Film Crusade series, as the relationship between story and identity is near and dear to its mission. That said, also, my apologies if you end up hearing background construction noises. I'm gonna do my best to remove them in post, but unfortunately, I'm recording this while contractors are working on fixing the basement flood, and so you might hear hammering or power tools periodically. I'm gonna do my best to remove it or to stop recording when it gets particularly loud, but I'm hoping that I'll be able to get most of it in post. So if you can hear a little bit, if you've got nice headphones, apologies in advance. The quality of the audio might be a little messy in some spots. Without further ado, let's get into Latent Christianity. Kairete! As I said in the intro, this is gonna be a longer one. For those of you who don't know, before I came to YouTube, I was, and still am, an author. Specifically, a fiction author, writing new weird, or a blend of sci-fi, fantasy, and horror that bends the main genre that the story takes place in. As such, I studied story and the ways that readers interact with written stories specifically in depth, and have discussed some of the concepts I'll reintroduce here in other videos. I'd like to give a quick aside here. When I refer to polytheists generally, I'm going to use the term pagan, as it's the term that I'm most familiar with and identify with personally, as well as the term most commonly used by revivalist polytheists to identify themselves. If you find that offensive due to the historical context of said term, or just don't identify with it, feel free to substitute the word polytheist mentally, as I mean them to be synonymous for the purposes of this talk. I know there are atheopagans who don't believe in the gods, but the central point of the end part of this discussion pertains uniquely to polytheists, so I'm not really talking about them. That said, I do think that some of the discussions of things like latent Christianity on the individual level do pertain to both atheists and atheopagans, so if you find those portions useful to you, then more power to you. I'm absolutely happy that you've been able to find use in my work. With that out of the way, let's move on to part 1, definitions through history. What is latent Christianity? To get a good definition, let's look at the history of the term. The first instance that I could find of it being used was actually in a collection called God in the Dock back in 1972 by notable Lion Daddy author C.S. Lewis, specifically in an essay entitled Christian Apologetics. I've got a few shots from the Kindle edition of that collection up on the screen. The crux of Lewis's argument rests on the idea that Christians will be better served by writing all the best books on science without preaching the gospel overtly, but rather by keeping their Christianity in the wardrobe, latent or hidden. This is actually an ethos that Lewis was well known for. Today, there are a ton of jokes online about how Aslan is actually Jesus, and comparisons between the Chronicles of Narnia and the notably atheist and nihilist leanings of his Dark Materials series from Philip Pullman are the subject of numerous content creators. But at the time of him writing, it was a technique that I hadn't seen explored in any earlier writings. This popularized the term in Christian circles, where it appears in blog posts and marketing material for literary agencies going back online to the mid-2000s, though I'm sure it was discussed in person and outside of public spaces significantly more than that. We even see the term in video essays from the mid-2010s discussing latent Christianity and Tolkien. It appears largely to have been used in media analysis and as a methodology for Christians bent on proselytizing covertly to use media to do so at an early stage. But why would this work so effectively? We're not just mindless sheep who adopt everything we see and hear, are we? Lewis hints at the answer in his work, but I'd like to explore this idea further using his own words as a baseline. The following quote is slightly abridged for readability, though the full quote is on screen. In the essay, Lewis himself states that, "The difficulty we are up against is this. We can make people, often, attend to the Christian worldview for half an hour or so, but the moment that they have gone away from our lecture, or laid down our article, they are plunged back into a world where the opposite position is taken for granted. As long as this situation exists, widespread success is simply impossible. We must attack the enemy's line of communication. What we want is not more little books about Christianity, but more little books by Christians on other subjects, with their Christianity latent. It is not the books written in direct deference of materialism that make the modern man a materialist. It is the materialistic assumptions in all the other books. In the same way, it is not books on Christianity Christianity that will really trouble him, but he would be troubled if, whenever he wanted a cheap popular introduction to some science, the best work on the market was always by a Christian. I'm going to caveat this next portion with the warning that I'm not a mental health professional or an expert, and I've only really studied mental health from the perspective of a few college courses and papers and such that I've been able to read on my own. With that said, many current theories in psychology exist around a perceived fundamental truth that Lewis reflects here, that human identity, ultimately, is a culmination of the stories we tell ourselves, and the truth of those stories isn't in the words themselves, but in the implications and values of those truths. Put another way, if all the best work on science are available from a Christian perspective touting Christian values without once naming Christ, then the viewpoint that science and Christianity are opposed erodes away because the story of that opposition no longer holds utility. Lewis himself expressed a keen understanding of this in his own work. The Screwtape Letters are probably among the most overt of his fictive works and yet still capture the imagination and humor of modern audiences as much as Narnia. Despite being an overtly avowed Christian, many of us who have deconverted still find Narnia and the narratives of it near and dear to our hearts. But I want to expand this notion a bit further. Part 2. Story and Identity. The complex interaction between the stories we tell ourselves and the stories told both about and to us, as well as the stories told about those perceived to be like us, are the subject of numerous extensive works, including a ton of video essays here on YouTube, though I'd like to dip my toe in here as well. The most useful work that I've found in discussing this particular phenomenon is the collection Identity and Story, Creating Self in Narrative from the APA, or the American Psychological Association. There are a number of useful essays and papers in it, but the one I'd like to focus on here is from Peter Raggatt, titled Multiplicity and Conflict in the Dialogical Self. It's a mouthful, so let's break it down a bit. The introduction of the paper posits the idea of a single unifying story to define your whole life is ludicrous on its face, due to the scattershot nature of how our memories work. If you were asked right now to tell your life story, would you be able to do so in a way that would satisfy you and cover all the bases you'd feel you'd need to in order to express your whole self? Where would you even begin? With your work? Your fondest memories from childhood? A particular traumatic event that shaped you? Or an especially wonderful break? How would the stories of those surrounding you change that narrative? Would you craft it with an eye toward their perspectives as well? Or would you tell your truth brazenly, regardless of whose feathers it would ruffle? And most importantly, would it even be possible to tell the whole of your story in a way that would be accessible to others and still encapsulate everything you wanted or needed to say? Or would crafting such a tale necessitate the omission of asides that don't fit the grand narrative that you would want to portray? After all, when you're talking about stories, there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. And everything that doesn't serve the story, as they say in the writing world, that's a darling that needs to be cut. As an example, we can look at the life of a public figure through two lenses. Many versions of the life of Mother Teresa have been published through the last several decades. Viewed through a Catholic lens, her life story would be portrayed as one of endless self-sacrifice in a land foreign to her for what she saw as the greater good of a God driving her to that end. But viewed from a different lens, that of many of the families of those who came to seek her aid, she was a sadistic abuser who used the language of God and Christianity to justify allowing or perpetually perpetuating suffering and torment to continue under her watch. The specific events highlighted and the way in which they're portrayed in each of these narratives will leave the reader or viewer with a very different perception of what happens despite having the same life, the same pool of events and occurrences to draw from. Coming back to Raggatt, his solution is to propose that there are in fact multiple selves in dialogue with one another as narrators in your life, not in the sense of multiple personalities, a la the experience of systems with multiple headmates, but rather multiple shifting narrative perspectives in your mind. He argues that your identity as a person is a dialogue between these conflicting narratives about which should take precedence at any given time. Let's take a look at another example to kind of give you an idea of what I mean. Let's say you're in the broom closet, and fortunate enough to live in a household where no one minds the smell of incense in your room. It's Easter Sunday, and you just woke up extra early to give a special offering to the gods you love on your stealth altar. Within the hour, your parents drag you off to church service, where you smile and mutter during the songs, and do your best to portray the happy, faithful Christian, with the faint scent of incense still lingering on your clothes and skin. The dissonance of blasphemy in this space settles in, because the story you told yourself about your pagan devotion to your gods, the actions you committed prior to getting here, the pagan narrative, is coming into stark conflict with the Christian narrative currently being told back to you. The self you are with your parents is Christian, at least outwardly so, and coming into direct conflict with your private pagan self, the one you might only share online or with your closest trusted friends. When you're at church, it's natural to feel a creeping doubt about the validity of the pagan private self, because in that moment, the child self, the so-called Christian one, is taking precedence. Outwardly, you're not acting out your private beliefs, which calls into question their validity even once you return to your room to make more offerings in the future. If you're not openly living who you are, you ask yourself, then how can you say that this is who you truly are? How can you say this is your true self? Raggatt proposes that the push in psychology and culture to pressure all these different selves into a unified identity ultimately becomes harmful, as such a thing might not actually exist, even if from any particular moment it might appear as though it does. Child you is still a pagan, despite being in the broom closet with your parents, but to your parents, the story being told to them, and from them back to you, is that of a Christian. All of these processes are subconscious. Most people, prior to being exposed to these ideas, might have a vague sense of being a quote-unquote different person with their friends as opposed to their family. Maybe even with the feeling that one is more authentic somehow than the other, without diving much further into why that is. The obsessive notion of a true self often blocks further reflection on these ideas. There must be a real me, we insist. I just don't know which one it is. All of these selves, Raggatt asserts, are actually coexisting narrators of different life stories relating to the roles you play in your life. Which brings us back to latent Christianity. The stories that many of us were told growing up about the old gods were often couched in the narrative that their myths were entirely untrue and made up to explain natural occurrences by simple-minded people. Zeus and Thor were created to explain lightning, and all the depths of their stories surrounding them was a result of human genius gifted by the one true god, and not any truth given from either of them as a real divine entity. Pagans in ancient times are often reframed by modern people as either really atheists, naive and stupid for their beliefs, or poor saps who are really, in fact, deceived by demons who led them away from the one true god. They're never really allowed to be, well, people first really, but also pagan. By extension, neither are we. Contrast this with the narratives many of us were sold about the Bible and its tales, which can range from absolute truth and literalness of every story contained therein to some being literal, such as Christ's existence and resurrections for our sin, that's an important one, and some metaphorical, such as the Tower of Babel. Even for those of us who were taught to take the stories literally, stories like Sodom and Gomorrah had narratives that we were given about what they meant. Growing up, stress was put on the idea that the denizens of those cities wanted to violate the consent of the angels, and Lot's decision to give up his daughters to Satan them was seen as a positive, virtuous trait, rather than examining the perspective of the daughters and how their consent would be violated. Many creators have dived far more deeply into biblical stories and their traditional interpretations versus the modern ones, so I won't linger too long here. But when you stop and think about the effect the stories we experience can have on us, as though we'd experienced the events ourselves, a clear picture starts to emerge about the insidiousness of latent Christianity in the media and why it can linger in our lives long after deconversion. Tell me, the last time you saw a movie, unless the theater or room was rather disruptive and loud or you were heavily interrupted, do you remember staring at a screen? Or do you remember the events as though you were seeing them yourself? Do those memories of movie scenes play in your head as though you had experienced them? Or do they play as though you were staring at a screen? Do you still see the wall in the background or the people in the theater when you think about the movie that you saw? When you read, do you lose yourself in the perspective of the characters or simply recall the words on the page? Although I know some folks are limited in the latter case by neurochemistry regarding visualization, my point stands that for the majority of folks and how we experience story, stories become a part of us, and by extension, so do the truths and lessons they contain. People often report gaining empathy for groups or realizing the gravity of events after experiencing a piece of media from the perspective of that group or covering that event from an avowedly first-hand perspective. This is why representation is so essential, and why own voices are so key when discussing complex issues. Stories literally shape us. And stories from the dominant perspective, which is still largely Christian or Muslim worldwide, depending on the country, push that dominant narrative deep under the skin if left unexamined. This doesn't mean you must interact critically with every piece of media you encounter, but it does mean that if you're struggling with self-doubt over your beliefs, looking at the stories you might still be telling yourself from your earlier days can be a pretty good start. Part 3. Introspection and Community. Most of you all watching this likely first encountered the term latent Christianity in the past few years, when Ocean Keltoy and other content creators popularized it as a tool for self-reflection for deconverts looking at the ways their former faith might be messing with their current worldview. It was certainly my first exposure to it. Latent Christianity is, in this context, lingering Christian attitudes and assumptions that cling to our perceptions long after deconversion. Or put another way, lingering Christian narratives in our identities that interfere with the new beliefs and experiences we aim to cultivate within the traditions we adopt later in life. This also extends to the cultural forces that can shape the worldview even of those who have never been Christian, but grew up in predominantly Christian cultures. The most common example given in discussions of latent Christianity is the lingering fear of hell that a lot of pagans feel after deconversion or during the early parts of their journeys into pagan traditions. This fear can manifest in the form of nightmares or panic, or can strike in the middle of ritual. Who among revivalists hasn't felt that lingering doubt? What if I'm actually sacrificing to demons like my priest or patron told me I am? What if I'm gonna burn for eternity? Often these doubts pass with time, but it can be particularly brutal and lingering in those who came from the fire and brimstone denominations. In order to free ourselves from this fear, we need to examine what narrative we're still clinging to that causes it to resurface, and what other influences that narrative might have. For example, the hellfire narrative, even when abolished in the direct sense, as in you're not scared you're gonna go to hell anymore, can still later transform into a need to, quote-unquote, be right. Whether it's in the form of orthodoxy, or the need to replace the authority of a single text like the Bible with the overbearing authority of historical scholarship, which, often disagrees with itself and suffers from its own biases. Link is in the iCard to my video on bias and scholarship. In that case, the hellfire narrative transforms into the belief that there is only one true way to believe or practice, or only one universal truth that can be adopted. All other beliefs are wrong, or, dare I say it, blasphemous. Even when the stakes involved with being wrong are no longer clear, the emotion and lingering beliefs still shout that being wrong is dangerous, and obedience is mandatory until those narratives are identified and rooted out. It can also manifest in the adoption or assumption of mythic literalism regarding ancient myths, even for those found in cultures where the evidence that the ancient people themselves saw the myths in this way is scant or non-existent. Link is in the iCard to my video on whether or not Zeus is a predator for a deeper look at that topic. The fear of readopting these narratives can itself metamorphose into an aversion for certain terms that would be essential to that tradition. Terms like worship or offering. Although kneeling for prayer wasn't as traditional in Hellenism, it was in religions like heathenry and some Celtic traditions. But the need to distance themselves as far as possible from Christianity creates an aversion to concepts that are central to a tradition's view of the human relationship to the divine. Some pagans even refuse to use the word prayer in relation to their communication with the divine, which itself is the most central way in which communication is done in the majority of pagan traditions. Now, the tradition that I'm most familiar with is revived Hellenism, specifically classical Athenian Hellenism. I see these lingering attitudes ravaging this community with a distressing regularity. Neoplatonist groups will often attempt to impose an orthodoxy on non-Neoplatonists, which I've been assured in the past is bad Platonism, and put themselves on a hierarchy above those of us who don't explore the divine in precisely the way that they do. Groups like the YSCE insist that only ethnic Greeks can define the future of Hellenism, despite a large population of non-Greeks expressing interest in the theoi and the ancient practice. Fights break out in forums over whether or not modern food items can be given as offerings, and cult leaders take advantage of the chaos to establish themselves as supposed priests, giving no mind to the role that priests actually played in the traditions they claim to revive. I can't blame individuals for their feelings and these struggles. Growing up in a predominantly Christian culture will do this to anyone. And many of us in revived traditions are beset on all sides by a relentless cultural pressure to conform. The very definitions of religion that most folks, including many scholars, hold are Christianized. Oh, you don't have a central authoritative text? That's not a religion, it's a cult. You don't have a service with regular holidays you attend? You must be delusional, honey. Oh, your organization doesn't have a priesthood that is specifically ordained through a training ceremony to perform marriages and funerals? That's not a religion, and you won't get national recognition or protection for religious freedoms because it doesn't look enough like Christianity. The mental health toll alone that these things take on the average pagan is enough to make your head spin. Yet we persist because we feel that drive to connect to the gods, to build a relationship of charis or reciprocity with them. I covered charis thoroughly in both my last video and my definitional video on the term. Link is in the iCard above if you're interested. So I'm going to proceed with the hope that you all are familiar with the use of charis in Hellenism. It effectively means reciprocity, but it gets a lot deeper than that. It's easy to see how these latent attitudes can get between us and that that which we seek to build with the gods on both an individual and community level. After all, if latent Christianity is composed of stories we still subconsciously tell ourselves despite our desire to adopt new ones into our identity, it's obvious how the tension and resulting cognitive dissonance can do damage to the budding relationships we're attempting to build in both our new community and the gods that we've come to love and venerate. The simultaneous push away from that which is Christian and toward similarity for potential acceptance and legitimization hurts even the most self-reflective among us. Nowhere is this seen more than in discussions of the future of pagan traditions through the young, as the perpetual need to fight over whether or not it's appropriate to teach our traditions to our current or theoretical kids, and in what way, is a war fought continuously in revivalist communities. Not until they're teenagers, is one camp. Not at all, let them discover it themselves is another. Yes, but only if we insist that it's not the only truth and encourage exploration when they're older, is yet another position, and absolutely, why would I keep a major part of my life away from my kids is yet another. The last of these is often met with accusations of brainwashing, because it looks too much like, what? Christianity. So what are we as a community to do about this? Introspection is a fantastic start, even if you didn't deconvert from a Christian tradition. I've met pagans who started as atheists and still try to seek an absolute and universal truth or impose a hierarchy onto the gods across traditions that may not actually be there, simply because they had absorbed the idea that it must exist from their surrounding culture. As we discussed earlier, these values can transfer into the mind and heart through the constant regurgitation through popular stories, and many popular stories contain strong Christian elements, despite seeming on the surface to be secular. That is, after all, what Film Crusade sets out to examine as a series. On a community level, however, we need to start a wider conversation amongst ourselves about what it means to be members of a particular pagan tradition. In other words, we need to create some stories of our own, answering questions like, what purpose should our priesthood, if one is established for specific traditions within wider religions, serve? Should we conform to the Christian expectations of what priests do in order to gain legal recognition internationally for our revived faiths? Or should we settle, as many organizations have, for protection as educational or historical organizations and risk individual members having to claim to be Wiccan in order to have our rights respected? What does it mean to be a member of a specific tradition? Does a Wiccan who worships Zeus in the Wiccan way qualify as a Hellenist, or is there a standard of praxis or knowledge that qualifies you? Is it a matter of self-identification, or do we need a more centralized set of organizing bodies to represent various traditions and make historically accurate praxis easy to access for those who feel a calling from the gods? What would a pagan piece of art or a pagan story center as its message? That second to last bit is my mission as a YouTuber. Though I have little interest at present in creating some sort of centralized organizing body, I'm much better off as a teacher. I've tried to create a series of free videos to make introductory Hellenism of a specific flavor easy to access for those who feel the need to connect with the Theoi, because to me, Goddess is the core of what being a revivalist pagan is all about. We didn't come to our traditions to bicker over the proper incense offering to Zeus. We came to connect with the awesome being he is and that the other gods are. Some of us came to connect with their roots, others felt a calling or had a divine experience. But what unites us is that desire to connect. And if we don't stop to examine these biases and the way they divide us both from each other and from the gods, we'll have no hope of seeing these revivalist movements continue into the future beyond us. Thank you so much for sticking through that. If you're new here, coerce the subscribe button with stories of a pagan nature and prompt the like for introspection. Drop that into the comments and let me know about the stories you've struggled with ridding yourself of, and the new ones you'd prefer to adopt instead. I'm really interested in a wider perspective on the issues we're struggling with as a community, and whether or not any of you would like me to cover some that I haven't covered in the past. Special thanks also to my patrons. I mentioned to you all several weeks back that I wanted to retool this script into a video here on the channel, and you graciously allowed me to do so despite the fact that part of it had already been presented elsewhere. I never would have gotten as deep into this topic on this channel if you all hadn't encouraged me, and I thank you, as the relationship between story and identity and the way that stories shape us is a deep passion of mine as an author. May the cycle of reciprocity between us ever remain positive. And remember, we're stronger together.